Sarah Martinez stepped off the crowded city bus, her crisp military uniform drawing curious glances from passers-by. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pavement as she made her way toward the prestigious Grandview restaurant, where she had reservations for her younger brother's graduation celebration. Her polished boots clicked rhythmically against the concrete sidewalk, each step filled with pride for the service she had dedicated her life to. The restaurant's glass doors gleamed in the sunlight, and through them, Sarah could see the elegant interior with its crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths. She had saved for months to afford this special lunch, wanting to give her brother Miguel something memorable after he completed his engineering degree. The uniform she wore represented 5 years of dedicated service in one of the military's most secretive and demanding units, though few people ever recognized the subtle insignia that marked her as something far beyond an ordinary soldier. As Sarah approached the entrance, she noticed a small crowd had gathered near the restaurant's front steps. Several well-dressed individuals were engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with the restaurant's management. Their voices carried an air of authority and entitlement that made other pedestrians step aside and watch from a safe distance. She paid little attention to the commotion, focused instead on checking her watch and ensuring she would arrive on time for the reservation. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and Sarah stepped into the cool, air-conditioned interior. The restaurant buzzed with the quiet conversation of lunch patrons, the gentle clinking of silverware against fine china, and the soft notes of classical music playing overhead. The hostess station stood empty momentarily, but Sarah waited patiently, taking in the sophisticated atmosphere that seemed worlds away from the military bases and training facilities where she typically spent her days. A young hostess appeared, her smile bright and welcoming until her eyes fell upon Sarah's uniform. The woman's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features as she glanced toward the restaurant's interior, then back at Sarah. Behind the hostess, Sarah could see other staff members whispering among themselves, their eyes occasionally darting in her direction, with expressions that seemed to mix curiosity with something else she couldn't quite identify. "Good afternoon," Sarah said politely, her voice carrying the clear, confident tone that came naturally from years of military training. "I have a reservation under Martinez for 2 people at 12:30. She reached into her uniform pocket to retrieve the confirmation number she had written down, but the hostess raised her hand in a gesture that suggested she should wait. The hostess stepped away from her station and walked quickly toward a man in an expensive suit who appeared to be the restaurant's manager. Sarah watched as they engaged in a whispered conversation, both occasionally glancing in her direction. The manager's face grew increasingly serious as the discussion continued, and Sarah began to sense that something was wrong. Other patrons in the waiting area started to notice the unusual attention she was receiving, their conversations growing quieter as they observed the unfolding situation. Miguel would be arriving within the next 15 minutes, fresh from his graduation ceremony with their parents and extended family in tow. Sarah had specifically chosen this upscale restaurant because she wanted to show her little brother how proud she was of his achievements. The scholarship he had earned, the long nights of studying, and his determination to become the first engineer in their family deserved recognition in a place that reflected the magnitude of his accomplishment. The manager approached Sarah with measured steps, his expression carefully controlled but unmistakably tense. Other restaurant staff had begun to gather at a respectful distance, some pretending to arrange table settings while others simply watched the developing situation with obvious interest. The elegant dining room continued its normal rhythm, but Sarah could feel the weight of attention settling upon her like a heavy blanket. "Excuse me, miss," the manager said, his voice professionally polite but carrying an undertone that suggested this conversation would not go as Sarah expected. "I'm afraid we need to discuss your attire before we can seat you this afternoon." His eyes focused on her uniform, with an intensity that made Sarah instinctively straighten her posture. A reflexive response developed through countless hours of military training and discipline. Sarah felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach, the same sensation she had experienced in combat zones when situations suddenly shifted from routine to potentially dangerous. She had encountered discrimination before, though never quite so boldly or in such an upscale establishment. The manager's words hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Sarah realized that her brother's celebration lunch was about to become something entirely different than what she had planned. Sarah's eyebrows drew together in confusion as she processed the manager's words. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand what you mean about my attire," she replied, glancing down at her immaculate uniform. Every crease was sharp, every button polished to perfection, and her boots reflected the restaurant's overhead lighting like mirrors. She had spent extra time that morning ensuring her appearance met the highest military standards, wanting to look her absolute best for this special occasion. The manager cleared his throat uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the group of well-dressed individuals who had now entered the restaurant behind Sarah. "Our establishment has certain dress code requirements," he began, his voice growing slightly louder as if performing for an audience. "Military uniforms can make some of our other patrons feel uncomfortable. We pride ourselves on maintaining a peaceful civilian atmosphere where people can enjoy their meals without reminders of conflict or violence." Behind the manager, Sarah noticed several staff members had stopped their normal duties to watch the confrontation unfold. The hostess fidgeted nervously with her reservation book, while two servers stood frozen near the kitchen entrance, their trays temporarily forgotten. The classical music continued to play softly overhead, creating an almost surreal backdrop to the increasingly tense situation developing in the restaurant's elegant foyer. "Sir, with respect, I'm simply here to have lunch with my family," Sarah said, her military training helping her maintain composure despite the rising frustration she felt. "My brother just graduated from university, and this meal is meant to celebrate his achievement. I made this reservation weeks ago, and I've never been told that my uniform would be inappropriate in a public restaurant." Her voice remained steady, but those who knew her well would have recognized the slight tightening around her eyes that signaled her growing anger. One of the well-dressed individuals from the group outside pushed forward, his expensive watch catching the light as he gestured dismissively toward Sarah. "Look, nobody wants to see military people flaunting their war games while we're trying to enjoy a civilized meal," he said loudly enough for nearby diners to hear clearly. "There are plenty of other places more suitable for people like you. This restaurant caters to a more sophisticated clientele who prefer not to be reminded of unpleasant realities." The man's words created a ripple of murmurs throughout the nearby tables, with some patrons nodding in apparent agreement, while others looked visibly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from a deep, burning indignation at being treated like a second-class citizen for serving her country. She had faced enemy fire, survived grueling training exercises, and sacrificed years of her life for the freedom that allowed these people to speak so dismissively about her service. "Perhaps you could change into civilian clothes," the manager suggested, his tone attempting to sound reasonable while his eyes pleaded with Sarah to simply comply and avoid further scene. "We could hold your table for an additional 30 minutes, to give you time to return in more appropriate attire. I'm sure you understand that we're simply trying to accommodate all of our guest preferences and maintain the ambiance our customers expect." Sarah's jaw clenched as she realized the full scope of what was happening. These people weren't just asking her to change clothes. They were demanding that she hide the very thing she was most proud of in her life. The uniform represented years of sacrifice, countless hours of training, and a commitment to serve others that few people would ever understand or appreciate. She thought of her fellow service members who had died wearing similar uniforms, defending the rights of people exactly like those who now wanted her to hide her service from view. Miguel's excited voice suddenly cut through the tension as he bounded through the restaurant's front doors, still wearing his graduation gown and carrying his diploma case. "Sarah, you look amazing," he called out, his face beaming with joy and pride. Behind him, their parents and two aunts followed, all dressed in their finest clothes and chattering excitedly about the graduation ceremony they had just attended. The family group stopped abruptly as they sensed the charged atmosphere and saw the crowd of people surrounding Sarah. The manager's face grew even more uncomfortable as he realized the situation had just become significantly more complicated. What had begun as a simple request to remove a uniform had now expanded into a public confrontation involving an entire family, creating exactly the kind of scene that upscale restaurants typically worked hard to avoid. The other patrons had stopped pretending to ignore the situation and were now openly staring at the unfolding drama. some even taking out their phones to record what appeared to be an increasingly volatile situation. Sarah's mother stepped forward, protectively, her eyes flashing with the same fierce determination that Sarah had inherited. "What exactly is going on here?" she demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had raised 5 children and wasn't easily intimidated by anyone. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah realized that her quiet, family celebration was about to become something much larger and more significant than anyone had anticipated. The manager's face flushed red as he found himself surrounded by Sarah's family, all of whom were staring at him with expressions ranging from confusion to growing anger. Miguel still clutched his diploma case, his graduation joy rapidly fading as he began to understand that his sister was being humiliated because of her military service. Their father, a quiet man who rarely raised his voice, stepped closer to the manager with his shoulders squared and his jaw set in a way that suggested decades of hard work had built strength that went far beyond physical appearance. "And they want me to remove my uniform before they'll serve us," Sarah explained to her family, her voice carefully controlled but carrying undertones of barely contained fury. "Apparently my military service makes their other customers uncomfortable, and they believe this restaurant is too sophisticated for people like me." She gestured toward the well-dressed group that had started this confrontation, several of whom were now looking less confident as they faced the united front of Sarah's clearly outraged family members. Miguel stepped forward, his graduation gown rustling as he moved between his sister and the manager. "This is ridiculous," he said, his young voice cracking with emotion. "My sister has served our country for 5 years. She's been deployed to dangerous places while people like you sat safely in restaurants complaining about your food being too cold. She saved money for months to bring us here for my graduation, and you want her to hide the things she's most proud of?" The restaurant had grown noticeably quieter as more patrons became aware of the confrontation. Several tables of diners had stopped eating entirely, their attention focused on the drama unfolding near the entrance. Some looked sympathetic towards Sarah's situation, while others appeared annoyed that their expensive meals were being interrupted by what they considered an unnecessary disturbance. The staff continued to hover nervously, clearly unsure whether to intervene or simply let the situation play out. One of the well-dressed men from the original group stepped forward again, his voice carrying the kind of entitled arrogance that comes from never being challenged. "Look, this isn't personal against your sister," he said, addressing Miguel while completely ignoring Sarah. "It's just that some of us have strong feelings about military involvement in foreign conflicts. We don't want to be reminded of violence while we're trying to enjoy our lunch. Surely you can understand that there are appropriate places for military displays, and expensive restaurants aren't among them." Sarah's mother had heard enough. "Military displays?" she repeated, her voice rising to a level that commanded attention throughout the restaurant. "My daughter isn't displaying anything except the uniform she earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. She's not carrying weapons or talking about war. She's trying to celebrate her brother's graduation in a public restaurant that should be proud to serve someone who has dedicated her life to protecting ungrateful people like you." The tension in the restaurant reached a breaking point as other diners began to take sides. An elderly man at a corner table stood up slowly, his own military bearing evident despite his civilian clothes. "Young lady," he called out to Sarah across the dining room, "thank you for your service. Anyone who has a problem with your uniform has a problem with me as well." His words sparked a murmur of agreement from several other tables, though the original group of complainers looked even more determined to have their way. Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions washing over her as she realized the situation had spiraled far beyond anything she had anticipated. The simple lunch she had planned to honor Miguel's achievement had become a public debate about military service, respect, and the right to exist in civilian spaces while wearing the uniform she had earned. Part of her wanted to simply leave and find another restaurant, but a larger part recognized that this moment represented something much more significant than a single meal. The manager found himself caught in an increasingly impossible situation, with vocal customers on both sides and a story that was clearly going to spread far beyond his restaurant, regardless of how he handled it. Security cameras had captured everything. Staff members were undoubtedly already sharing details with friends and family, and several patrons were still recording with their phones. His decision in the next few minutes would define not only this moment but Potentially his restaurant's reputation for years to come. Sarah straightened her shoulders and made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. "You know what?" she said, her voice carrying across the now silent restaurant with crystal clarity. "You want me to remove my uniform? Fine, I'll remove my uniform." Her family looked at her in shock, and even the manager seemed taken aback by her sudden compliance. But something in Sarah's tone suggested that what was about to happen was not the victory that her opponents expected. She began reaching toward the collar of her military jacket, her movements deliberate and precise. Every eye in the restaurant focused on her hands as she prepared to remove the uniform that had become the center of so much controversy. The silence stretched taut like a wire about to snap, and Sarah knew that whatever happened next would change everything for everyone watching. Sarah's fingers moved to the first button of her military jacket with ceremonial precision, her eyes never leaving the manager's face. The entire restaurant held its collective breath as she slowly began to unfasten the garment that had caused so much controversy. Her movements were deliberate and measured, as if she were participating in some formal military ceremony rather than complying with the demands of prejudiced restaurant patrons who couldn't tolerate the sight of her service uniform. "Since you insist that my uniform is inappropriate for your establishment," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent dining room, "I'll be happy to remove it. After all, customer service is important, isn't it?" Her tone remained perfectly polite, but there was something underneath it that made the manager shift uncomfortably and caused several of the complaining patrons to exchange uncertain glances with each other. As the jacket came off, Sarah folded it with the same meticulous care that military personnel use during inspection ceremonies. The restaurant's air conditioning felt cool against her arms, but she showed no sign of discomfort as she continued the process. Underneath the jacket, she wore a crisp white military shirt with short sleeves, and for the first time, several people in the restaurant could see her arms clearly. What they saw caused audible gasps throughout the dining room. Sarah's left arm bore a distinctive tattoo that ran from her shoulder to her elbow, featuring crossed swords surrounded by a wreath and 13 stars. But it wasn't just any military tattoo. The design included elements that made several of the older veterans in the restaurant straighten in their chairs with sudden recognition. The artwork incorporated symbols that were not widely known outside very specific military circles, indicators of service in units that most people had never heard of and would never be allowed to know about. More shocking still was Sarah's right arm, which showed the unmistakable scars of serious injury. 3 distinct marks ran parallel across her forearm, clearly the result of shrapnel or explosive damage that had required extensive medical treatment and rehabilitation. The scars were old but prominent, telling a story of sacrifice and survival that commanded respect from anyone who understood what they were looking at. Several restaurant patrons who had been supportive of the complaints against her uniform fell silent as they realized they were looking at someone who had clearly paid a physical price for her service. But it was what came next that truly stunned the room into complete silence. As Sarah continued to remove pieces of her uniform, she revealed more details about exactly who she was and what she had done during her military career. Around her neck, previously hidden by her uniform collar, hung a small chain with several items that made the elderly veteran at the corner table stand up straighter and salute without thinking. "You wanted to see what was under the uniform," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Well, here's what 5 years of military service looks like. Here's what it looks like when someone volunteers to go places that other people won't go, to do things that other people won't do, so that people like you can sit in restaurants and complain about being reminded that freedom isn't free." She held up her jacket and pointed to a small emblem on the chest that few civilians would recognize, but that made the knowledgeable veterans in the room draw sharp breaths. The emblem was black with silver details, featuring a skull surrounded by wings and lightning bolts. It was the insignia of the Death Brigade, one of the military's most secretive and elite units. Members of this unit were selected from the top 1% of Special Forces operatives and trained for missions that were so classified that most government officials weren't even aware they existed. The unit's members were known for operating in the most dangerous situations imaginable, often with no backup and no possibility of rescue if things went wrong. Miguel stared at his sister with new eyes, suddenly understanding that he had never truly known what she did during her deployments. Their parents looked equally shocked, realizing that the daughter they had worried about during her overseas assignments had been involved in operations far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The pride in their faces mixed with a deep concern as they began to comprehend the level of risk Sarah had voluntarily accepted in service to her country. The manager's face had gone completely white as he recognized the significance of what he was seeing. Restaurant owners in areas with significant military populations often received briefings about how to recognize and respect certain military credentials, and the Death Brigade emblem was specifically mentioned in those presentations. He realized that he had not only insulted a decorated veteran, but had potentially created an incident involving someone whose service record would be reviewed by people far more powerful than his restaurants. Corporate owners, the well-dressed group that had started the entire confrontation, began backing away slowly, their earlier confidence evaporating as they realized they had picked a fight with someone whose background was far beyond anything they had anticipated. One of them started to speak, perhaps attempting an apology or explanation, but Sarah's steady gaze silenced him before any words could emerge. The power dynamic in the restaurant had shifted completely, and everyone present understood that the situation had moved far beyond a simple complaint about dress codes. The silence in the restaurant stretched on as Sarah carefully refolded her jacket, her movements precise and controlled despite the obvious emotion she was fighting to contain. The Death Brigade emblem caught the overhead lights, its distinctive design serving as a stark reminder to everyone present that they were in the company of someone whose service had taken her to places most people couldn't even imagine. The elderly veteran at the corner table approached slowly, his own military bearing evident in every step. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying the respect that one warrior shows to another. "Staff Sergeant Williams, retired Marine Corps. I served 2 tours in Vietnam, and I thought I knew something about sacrifice until I learned what the Death Brigade does for our country." He extended his hand toward Sarah, who accepted the gesture with the same composure she had maintained throughout the confrontation. "It would be my honor to buy lunch for you and your family today, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." Other veterans in the restaurant began to identify themselves, rising from their tables with expressions of respect and gratitude that created a stark contrast to the hostility Sarah had initially encountered. A woman wearing a navy pin on her civilian jacket walked over with tears in her eyes, followed by a young man whose army tattoo was visible on his wrist. What had begun as an attempt to humiliate Sarah had instead created an impromptu gathering of military personnel who understood exactly what her uniform and emblems represented. The manager found himself in a rapidly deteriorating situation as more patrons began expressing their support for Sarah while directing increasingly angry comments toward both him and the group that had demanded her uniform removal. Social media posts were already beginning to appear, with several diners sharing photos and videos of the confrontation, along with commentary about how poorly the restaurant had handled the situation. The establishment's online reviews were starting to reflect the incident, and the manager realized that his decision to side with the complainers was likely to have lasting consequences for his business. Miguel moved closer to his sister, his graduation joy now replaced by a deep pride mixed with concern, as he began to understand the full scope of what Sarah had sacrificed during her military service. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the conversations that had erupted throughout the dining room. "We knew you were deployed overseas, but we never knew it was anything like this. We never knew you were part of something so dangerous." Sarah's expression softened as she looked at her younger brother, the fierce composure she had maintained during the confrontation giving way to the protective love she felt for her family. "Because it was my job to make sure you never had to know," she replied, reaching out to straighten his graduation gown with the same gentle care she had shown while folding her uniform. "The whole point of what we do is so that people like you can focus on building careers and families and futures without having to worry about the kind of threats we handle. That's why we volunteer for it." The well-dressed group that had initiated the complaint began making hasty excuses and moving toward the exit, clearly realizing that public opinion in the restaurant had turned decisively against them. Their earlier confidence had completely evaporated as they found themselves facing not just Sarah, but an entire community of military supporters who were no longer willing to remain silent. Several other diners called out sharp criticisms as the group passed their tables, creating an uncomfortable gauntlet that served as a fitting conclusion to their misguided attempt to shame a decorated veteran. As the complainers left, the atmosphere in the restaurant began to transform into something resembling a celebration, rather than a confrontation. The hostess, who had been watching everything with growing horror at how her establishment had handled the situation, approached Sarah with visible nervousness but determination to make things right. "Ma'am, please let me escort you and your family to our best table," she said, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. "Your meal today is completely complimentary, and I want to personally apologize for how you were treated when you arrived." Sarah looked around the restaurant, taking in the faces of people who had initially been strangers, but had become supporters simply because they recognized the value of military service when they saw it. The elderly Marine veteran nodded encouragingly, while other patrons offered smiles and gestures of respect that created a warmth Sarah hadn't expected to find in this upscale establishment. She realized that while the confrontation had been painful and infuriating, it had also revealed something important about the character of the people around her. But the manager, recognizing that his initial decision had created a public relations disaster for his restaurant, approached with what appeared to be a prepared apology speech. His face was flushed with embarrassment and perhaps fear as he realized that videos of the incident were likely already spreading online, potentially reaching corporate executives who would want explanations for why their establishment had been seen attempting to discriminate against a decorated military veteran. The damage to the restaurant's reputation was already beginning, and everyone present understood that this incident would be remembered long after the immediate confrontation had ended. The manager approached Sarah with his hands clasped nervously in front of him, his earlier authority completely dissolved in the face of what had become a public relations catastrophe. "Ma'am, I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding," he began, his voice carrying the desperate tone of someone who realized his career might depend on the next few minutes. "I made a serious error in judgment and I want to make this right. Your family's meal today will be completely complimentary, and I'd like to offer you a standing reservation at our restaurant whenever you'd like to dine with us." Sarah studied the manager's face, seeing fear rather than genuine remorse in his expression. She understood that his apology was motivated more by concern for his business than by any real understanding of what he had done wrong. Around them, other diners continued to watch the interaction, many of them recording with their phones as the story continued to unfold. The incident had already begun spreading on social media, with hashtags like Veteran Respect and Death Brigade Honor trending as people shared their outrage over Sarah's treatment. "Your apology is noted," Sarah replied, her voice maintaining the professional tone she had used throughout the confrontation. "But you need to understand that this isn't about a free meal or special treatment. This is about the principle that military personnel shouldn't have to hide their service to make civilians comfortable. We don't wear these uniforms to intimidate people or make political statements. We wear them because we've earned the right to do so through sacrifice and dedication that most people will never understand." Miguel stepped closer to his sister, his graduation diploma now forgotten as he processed everything he had learned about her military service in the past hour. "The Death Brigade," he said quietly, testing the words as if speaking them aloud would help him understand their significance. "I've never heard of it before, but from everyone's reactions, it's something really important, isn't it?" His eyes searched Sarah's face, looking for answers to questions he was only beginning to know how to ask. The elderly Marine veteran who had first spoken up moved closer to their group, his weathered face showing the kind of respect that comes from understanding exactly what Sarah's service meant. "Son," he said to Miguel, "your sister is part of a unit that handles situations so dangerous and so classified that most of us who've served don't even know the details. What I can tell you is that Death Brigade personnel are selected from the absolute best of the best, and they volunteer for missions that other Special Forces units won't take. The fact that she's standing here alive means she's both incredibly skilled and incredibly lucky." Other patrons in the restaurant had begun approaching Sarah's family, offering words of support and gratitude that transformed the dining room into an impromptu celebration of military service. A young couple with a small child thanked Sarah for her sacrifice, while an older woman pressed a handwritten note into her hands expressing appreciation for her protection of American freedoms. The hostess had prepared their table with extra flowers and the restaurant's finest place settings, creating a fitting atmosphere for what had become Miguel's graduation celebration, despite the dramatic beginning. As news of the incident spread online, Sarah's phone began receiving messages from former military colleagues who had seen the videos and wanted to express their support. Several of her Death Brigade teammates sent congratulations for handling the situation with the dignity and composure that their training had instilled in all of them. The unit's commanding officer even sent a brief message expressing pride in how Sarah had represented their organization during a difficult situation. The transformation in the restaurant's atmosphere was remarkable, as staff members who had initially watched the confrontation with uncertainty now competed to provide excellent service to Sarah's family. Servers brought complimentary appetizers and ensured that water glasses never went empty, while the chef personally visited their table to discuss special preparations for their meal. The manager hovered nearby, clearly hoping that exceptional service might somehow mitigate the damage to his establishment's reputation. But Sarah knew that the real impact of this incident would extend far beyond a single restaurant meal. The videos circulating online were sparking conversations about military respect, civilian understanding of service sacrifice, and the challenges that veterans face when transitioning between military and civilian environments. Comment sections were filled with stories from other veterans who had faced similar discrimination, creating a broader dialogue about how society treats the people who volunteer to defend it. As the family finally sat down at their beautifully appointed table, Sarah put her uniform jacket back on with the same precision she had used to remove it. The Death Brigade emblem once again disappeared beneath the fabric, but everyone in the restaurant now understood what it represented. Miguel raised his water glass in a toast to his sister, his eyes bright with a new understanding of the woman who had always been his hero, but whom he was only now beginning to truly know. 3 hours later, Sarah and her family emerged from the restaurant into the late afternoon sunlight, their celebration meal having transformed into something far more meaningful than anyone had anticipated. Miguel carried not only his graduation diploma, but also a newfound understanding of the sister who had always supported his dreams while quietly making sacrifices he had never imagined. The elderly Marine veteran had insisted on exchanging contact information with Sarah, expressing interest in supporting veteran advocacy, organizations that she recommended. The manager had provided Sarah with a formal written apology and a commitment that his restaurant would implement mandatory sensitivity training for all staff members regarding military service and veteran recognition. More importantly, he had agreed to display a small plaque near the entrance acknowledging the service of military personnel and welcoming them regardless of whether they wore uniforms or civilian clothes. Sarah knew that real change often came from uncomfortable confrontations that forced people to examine their assumptions and prejudices. As they walked toward the parking area, Sarah's phone continued to buzz with messages from friends, family members, and fellow veterans who had seen the viral videos of the incident. News outlets had begun reaching out for interviews, and several veteran advocacy groups had expressed interest in using her story to highlight ongoing issues of military discrimination in civilian settings. What had started as a private family celebration had evolved into a public conversation about respect, service, and the bridges that needed to be built between military and civilian communities. Miguel walked beside his sister with a new sense of pride that went beyond his academic achievement. "I always knew you were brave," he said as they approached their car, "but I never understood that you were this kind of hero. When I think about how many times you've called to check on my studies or sent care packages during finals week, and all along you were dealing with things that most people couldn't handle for a single day." His voice carried the emotion of someone whose entire perspective had shifted in the course of a single afternoon. Their parents had remained mostly quiet during the walk to the car, processing their own complex emotions about discovering the true nature of their daughter's military service. Sarah's mother finally broke the silence as they reached the vehicle. "We're proud of you," she said simply, her words carrying the weight of years of worry and love. "We've always been proud of you, but now we understand why you couldn't tell us everything. We also understand why it was so important for you to wear your uniform today, even though it caused all this trouble." Sarah paused before getting into the car, looking back at the restaurant where her simple lunch plans had become a defining moment in her post-military life. She realized that the confrontation, while painful and frustrating, had served an important purpose in forcing both her and the people around her to articulate the value of military service in ways that everyday interactions rarely required. The incident had created an opportunity for education and understanding that might never have occurred under normal circumstances. In the days that followed, the restaurant experienced a surge of interest from military personnel and their families, who wanted to show support for the establishment's commitment to change. The manager's written apology had been shared widely online, and his promise to implement sensitivity training had earned praise from veteran organizations. More significantly, other businesses in the area began examining their own policies and staff training to ensure they wouldn't face similar situations. With military customers, Sarah returned to her military base with a new understanding of the impact that individual acts of courage could have beyond the classified missions that defined her professional life. Her Death Brigade colleagues had followed the story with interest, recognizing that her handling of civilian discrimination reflected the same leadership and composure that made her effective in their dangerous operations. The incident had demonstrated that the skills developed in elite military units could be just as valuable in everyday situations that required strength, dignity, and moral clarity. Miguel's graduation had indeed become unforgettable, though not in the way anyone had originally planned. As he began his career as an engineer, he carried with him not only his academic achievements but also a deeper appreciation for the sacrifices that military personnel make to protect the freedoms that allow people to pursue their dreams. The incident had strengthened the bond between brother and sister, while opening his eyes to aspects of military service that civilian education rarely addresses. Years later, when Sarah had completed her military service and transitioned to civilian life, she would often think about that afternoon at the restaurant as a turning point in her understanding of how military and civilian worlds intersected. The incident had taught her that sometimes the most important battles were fought not on foreign soil but in everyday places where prejudice and misunderstanding threatened the values she had sworn to defend. The viral nature of the story had connected her with hundreds of other veterans who shared similar experiences of discrimination or disrespect in civilian settings. Many reached out to thank her for standing up with dignity and showing that military personnel deserve the same respect in restaurants, stores, and public spaces that they provided through their service. The network of relationships that grew from that single confrontation became a source of support and advocacy that lasted long after the initial incident faded from social media attention. Miguel went on to become a successful engineer, but he never forgot the lesson he learned about his sister's courage that day. Throughout his career, he made it a point to hire and mentor veterans transitioning into civilian careers, understanding from personal experience the unique skills and perspectives that military service provided. His graduation celebration had become a family legend, retold at gatherings as an example of how standing up for principles could transform a moment of conflict into an opportunity for growth and understanding. The restaurant continued to honor its commitment to military sensitivity training, and the small plaque near the entrance became a symbol of how institutions could learn from their mistakes and create more welcoming environments for all customers. Sarah occasionally returned there for special occasions, always treated with the respect that should have been offered from the beginning, but now backed by a deeper understanding of what military service truly meant to the people who chose that path. The Death Brigade emblem that had shocked so many people that day remained a private reminder of Sarah's service, hidden beneath civilian clothes as she built a new life but never forgotten by those who understood its significance. The incident had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon a veteran could carry was simply the quiet dignity of someone who had served with honor and refused to be ashamed of that service. Regardless of what others might think or say about it,